for nearly half a century since the close of World War II in 1945. The entire region, as we have seen in these last three lectures, was under the direct or indirect hegemony of the Soviet Union, and that included almost all the countries where Carpatho-Rusyns lived: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, and of course, Transcarpathia in the Soviet Ukraine. And throughout this period, Soviet political influence was implemented by the ruling communist parties in each of these Central European satellite countries, satellites of the Soviet Union as they were known. Soviet economic influence was carried out through a union known as the commision. It was like their equivalent of the future European Economic Community or European Union. For commision, as a result of which the command economies of the satellites countries were now integrated with each other and also dependent on direction from the Soviet Union. By the last quarter of the 20th century, it had become clear to many within and outside this bloc of countries that the Soviet economy, and therefore the integrated economies of these Central European satellites, were not expanding. And on top of that, the general standard of living throughout the region was, after this spurt after the war, when they reconstructed everything, now it was at best stagnating, if not declining. There were, in fact, some efforts at political and economic reforms, most especially in Hungary and in Poland. But the kind of serious political as well as economic restructuring that was needed proved to be impossible until change first came in the Soviet Union. No one at the time expected changes to happen in the foreseeable future. And then in 1985, we have the appearance on the scene of someone named Mikhail Gorbachev. The Soviet communist leadership, faced with its own country's increasingly problematic economy, elected as the first secretary of the all-Soviet Communist Party this man named Mikhail Gorbachev. At the time, he was only 58, which made him the youngest person other than Lenin to ever hold that post as the first secretary of the Communist Party, all-Soviet Communist Party. He, together with a group of innovative advisors, were determined to restructure the Soviet economy and open it up and open up society to new ideas. And that approach was symbolized by two Russian words, perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika means simply restructuring. Glasnost, openness, comes from the Russian word glas for eye. Open your eyes. Look around, see what the problems are. the openness, in particular the glasnost, implied a willingness to listen to public criticism about how the country was being run. And also, as part of this proposed new phase of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev set out to change the Soviet Union's relationship with the United States and its rival, the capitalist West, from a relationship of confrontation to one that would be more characterized by negotiation and even cooperation. It was this radical transformation in Gorbachev's foreign policy that led to a profound change in the Soviet Union's relationship to those satellite countries that we've been talking about in Central Europe. Confident in their new relationship with the West, you know, you can only deal with people when they have some sense of self-confidence. If they don't, then that's a problem. And Gorbachev was a self-confident guy. And so then the Soviet reformers around him, they felt secure enough in themselves to decide that its satellite countries could, from now on, make whatever political and economic changes they felt necessary without fear of intervention from the Soviet military. And there was experience. There was the Germans in 1953 in Berlin, crushed. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956, crushed. The peaceful attempt to transform communist Czechoslovakia in 1968, crushed. Soviet tanks. So, okay, we can call for change. Oh, really? And then what? Well, Gorbachev looked at this differently. In essence, the Soviets unilaterally relinquished their control over Central Europe. The impossible suddenly seemed possible. By 1968, pardon, by 1989, Poland and Hungary led the way toward ending the exclusive role of their respective communist parties, and they began to decentralize their command economies. In October of 1989, the East Germany's communist government fell, and that country immediately set upon a path that within less than a year resulted in the reunification of Germany. And that, of course, was the famous scenes of the Berlin Wall being broken down in late 1989. Now, among the last countries in the region to accept change were Czechoslovakia and Romania. The case of Czechoslovakia. On November 17, 1989, what is today? Huh? The 15th. Okay, so 2 days from now, yeah, important date in modern Czechoslovak history and now Czech and Slovak history. On November 17th, a massive demonstration in Czechoslovakia's capital of Prague set in motion a series of events throughout the country that subsequently came to be known as the Velvet Revolution. Why? Because there was no violence. Actually, there was no violence in most of these enormous changes that we're discussing. Without any serious resistance, the communist rulers who had controlled the country for 4 decades were simply pushed aside and replaced by political and intellectual dissidents. Foremost among them was a man named Václav Havel, a major figure in the second half of the 20th century. He was elected provisional and then full president. Under him already, all the restrictions of the former era, censorship, closed borders, arbitrary arrests, domination of the Communist Party, all came to an end. Czechoslovakia's leaders were determined to overcome all aspects of what they called the totalitarian past and to return their country to the family of democratic European nation states. Havel himself, during these years, truly became a world celebrity in Western political, intellectual, and cultural circles, since he seemed to embody the tradition of humanism that in an earlier era had made Czechoslovakia a respected state under its own founding philosopher, President Thomas Masaryk, and hence the First Republic that we spoke about in the interwar years, highly respected, the only one that remained democratic until the end. And so now Havel is reigniting that tradition. The same month that he was elected president, in December 1989, when this peaceful or soft velvet revolution brought Václav Havel to the highest post in the land, farther south, in another Soviet satellite country, Romania, political change was to occur, but in a much more violent manner. Romania's feared and hated secret security service, the Securitate, was not about to give up control of the country to the democratic forces in that country. The Secret Service Securitate came out, fighting, started killing demonstrators, and all of that only ended when Romania's longtime communist dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu, and his politically active wife they stormed the palace, took him out, and on the last days of November 1989, shot them. And that was the end of Romania's all-powerful communist leaders. Now, in the Soviet Union itself, Gorbachev's reforms took some time before they reached all areas of the country. I mean, you can make all these proclamations, this happening in the main capital, but then there's this enormous country. And it took time before the reform feelings filtered down. And that included filtering down to Soviet Ukraine. In September, and it took a long time, and Ukraine had a very conservative leader, a man named Szczerbetsky, who was also a member of the Central Committee of the All-Soviet Communist Party and was one of the strong opponents of Gorbachev. Not everyone agreed with Gorbachev, by the way. But this Szczerbetsky was finally replaced in Ukraine by a more reform-minded leader. And then in early 1990, the Communist Party of Soviet Ukraine, as well as throughout the Soviet Union, was forced to relinquish its monopoly on power. Ever since the Bolshevik Revolution, only needed one party. And so it dominated everything. After 1990, no, it was no longer the only party. And from that moment, political developments in Soviet Ukraine also were directed not only by the communists, but by non-communist nationalist groups united in an umbrella organization which was known as Ruch, which, by the way, just simply means the movement. So in parliament, you had communists and non-communists in the Soviet Ukrainian parliament. And that led in July 1990 for that parliament to declare Ukraine, Soviet Ukraine, a sovereign state, not independence, by the way. We talked about autonomy, all kinds of autonomy. Well, you can also have sovereignty. That's like the highest possible, where allegedly everything in your land, in your country, is decided by the local government, even though it's not yet fully independent. Now, the other country where Carpatho-Rusyns lived, Yugoslavia, the green on this map, a mini Soviet Union with 6 national republics and 2 autonomous regions within one of those republics. Yugoslavia, a little bit different. First of all, it had not been a Soviet satellite. It was an attempt to make it, but in 1948, the head of the Yugoslav Communist Party, a man named Tito, broke with the Soviet Union, and so Yugoslavia was a communist country, but in between the West and the East. And it was still ruled by the Yugoslav Communist Party, both the federal government and each of the component national republics. Now, the Republic of Serbia, the largest of them, and the one that had 2 autonomous regions within it, always felt itself to be the more important element within the country. And in 1989, it made an ominous decision. It simply abolished the autonomous status of 2 of the regions within the Serbian Republic, one called Kosovo, which one still hears about today, dominated by the Albanian minority down here, and the other, the Vojvodina. We've heard the Vojvodina. About the Vojvodina, it's the northern part of Serbia because of Carpatho-Rusyns lived there. What was the result of Serbia unilaterally abolishing the autonomous status? The other republics in the Yugoslav Federation felt threatened that Serbia now was going to use this as a first step. And so several of them, first Slovenia, then Croatia, then Macedonia, and in early 1992, Bosnia-Herzegovina, secede from the Yugoslav Federation. In effect, communist Yugoslavia, as Yugoslavia, ceased to exist. Although its former government tried to hold on to power in at least 2 republics, Serbia and Montenegro, in what now was a drastically reduced country. It's now called Little Yugoslavia. All that was left were those 2 republics. All right, so what did these revolutionary changes sparked by the events of 1989, what did they mean for the various countries of Central and Eastern Europe where Carpatho-Rusyns lived? Ever since, or throughout this whole communist era? Well, in general, all the countries which experienced the change in regime, the reduced Yugoslavia was the only exception. All the others, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, etc., set up multi-party representative governments with a presidential office and a parliament chosen in free multi-party elections. These new liberal-oriented governments in virtually all of the region's countries did make serious attempts to overcome the shortcomings of the communist past, lifting censorship, releasing political prisoners, allowing freedom of religion, and symbolically and very important, opening the borders. Down came the Iron Curtain. And people could leave. And they did. Not to leave permanently, but finally to go to the rest of Europe. They're in Europe. Although each country addressed its economic problems differently, they all rejected the principle of the command economic system that the Soviets had employed and influenced them on, and allowed for private businesses to be established and for land from the collective and state farms to be returned to its former owners. So there was property restitution. Carpatho-Rusyns reacted very quickly to these enormous political and social changes, prompted, of course, by Gorbachev's reforms started back in 1985 and culminating now in 1989. At first glance, such a reaction seemed surprising, considering the fact that under communist-ruled regimes since World War II, nowhere except in Yugoslavia, which is the exception now, nowhere else did Carpatho-Rusyns exist as a legally recognized nationality and had no organizations, no civic life as Carpatho-Rusyns, because they didn't exist. But now it's 1989. Actually, the first Carpatho-Rusyns to act were those Lemkos in Poland, and they did so even before 1989 with this Vatra movement that we were just talking about. Gathering together for discussions. Who are we? There were, of course, already at these Vatras, debates between the Lemkos, some saying, we're a distinct people, distinct culture, others saying, no, we are part of the Ukrainian nationality. In April 1989, the supporters of the distinct Lemko-Rusin orientation established in the Silesian town of Legnica, that is, among those who were living abroad in Polish Silesia, something called the Lemko Association. Lemko Society, actually. Stowarzyszenie Lemki, April 1989, in Poland. Headed by a young Lemko born in the diaspora, born abroad in Western Poland. Before the end of 1989, the society began to publish an official organ, a magazine called Besida, or speech, talk, conversation, in the Lemko-Rusin vernacular. So for the first time, we now have publications in a variety of the Rusin language. And then in the course of 1990, activists in other countries also established civic and cultural organizations. In February 1990, the Society of Carpatho-Rusyns was established in Uzhhorod in Soviet Ukraine. And that's February 1990. So now we have two. This society initially attracted a wide spectrum of some of the leading civic activists, educators, and creative artists in Soviet Transcarpathia, all of whom wished to see their native Carpatho-Rusin culture revived and recognized as something distinct in Ukraine. A few months later, in Yugoslavia, a Rusin cultural foundation, it actually existed for a few years after World War II, it is restored. Now, in Yugoslavia, Rusins were recognized as a nationality throughout this whole communist period, the exception. But this renewed organization didn't want to be beholden to government money and government policy, and so that's why it came into existence to defend Rusin interests without government interference. This Rusin Cultural Foundation, in particular, opposed to those intellectuals in Yugoslavia who, while using the vernacular language, some of them nonetheless argued that the Vojvodinian Rusins were also a part of the Ukrainian nationality. Fourth country, Czechoslovakia. Within 1 week of the Velvet Revolution that occurred on, or started, as we now know, November 17, 1989, and toppled the communist regime. 1 week after that, a few activists in the city of Prešov established something called the Initiative Group of Czechoslovakia's Rusin Ukrainians for Reconstruction. I'm not going to write it down, but notice the terms here. It's an initiative group, so it's not yet formalized. Reconstruction, taken straight from Gorbachev's terminology, to reconstruct, and uses the term Rusyns Ukrainians together with a hyphen. So we're operating in the name of all of the people, regardless of how they identify themselves. Now, the goal of this initiative group was to resolve the nationality question and to replace the communist-era Cultural Union of Ukrainian Workers with this new organization that would promote the Carpatho-Rusyns as a distinct people and not as a branch of the Ukrainian nationality. Within it, almost immediately, there are controversies between the pro-Rusin-oriented people, the pro-Ukrainian-oriented people. Eventually, those pro-Rusin elements establish in Medzilaborce, which you know where it is because of your map, something called the Rusin Renaissance Society. I'll put it up here. The Rusin Renaissance Society. It actually comes into being formally in 1990, but symbolically on November 17th, literally 1 year after the Velvet Revolution in Prague. Before the end of that year, 1990, this Rusin Renaissance Society begins publishing an illustrated magazine called Rusin. All of these publications still exist, by the way. A few months later, it launched a weekly newspaper called Narodny Novinky, the People's News, and both of them appeared in the local Rusin vernacular language. So now we have new organizations in 4 post-communist countries. Doesn't make a difference of the country of location. The ideological message of each of these organizations was actually the same, and based on the following 4 principles. And this sums up the impact of 1989 in terms of the new Carpatho-Rusin movement. And what were those 4 principles? 1, Carpatho-Rusyns form one people or nationality, and with the exception of Yugoslavia and resettled groups in Poland, they live as the indigenous population in the valleys of the Carpathian Mountains, where their ancestors settled as long ago as the early Middle Ages. So that's principle 1, distinct nationality with an indigenous people with their homeland, their own homeland. Principle 2, Carpatho-Rusyns are not a branch of any other nationality, whether Ukrainian, Russian, Polish, or Slovak, but rather a distinct 4th East Slavic nationality. Third principle, as a distinct nationality, Carpatho-Rusyns need to have their own codified literary language based on spoken dialects. And 4, in all countries where Carpatho-Rusyns live, they should enjoy rights according to all national minorities within those countries, and that means use of the Rusin language in newspapers, radio, television, and most important, for instruction in schools. So there are the 4 principles of the post-1989 Carpatho-Rusyn, what we would call the third national revival, regardless of what country. Now, aside from establishing these organizations in each of the individual countries where Carpatho-Rusyns live, this now, what we can call an incipient post-1989 Carpatho-Rusyn movement, quickly realized the value of cross-border cooperation. They live in one historic homeland, but the historic homeland is divided by international boundaries. So what do you do with that? No one at the time considered seriously the creation of a Carpatho-Rusyn state. Very important. Though there were accusations directed against the movement, especially by its pro-Ukrainian antagonists who said, oh, they want to create a state, they want to change borders, and this is terrible for Europe. Never expressed that desire. In other words, most cultural activists accepted the fact that the historic land of Carpathian Rus was divided among 4 countries and that such political reality was not likely to change. But in order to compensate for these territorial divisions, some kind of international Carpatho-Rusyn organization seemed to be the best solution, and so the idea of a World Congress was born. A World Congress. The original intent of the Congress initiators was to meet in Soviet Transcarpathia. This is where the vast majority of Carpatho-Rusyns lived at the time. That turned out not to be possible. It was still the Soviet Union, by the way. So that the first World Congress of Rusyns took place in Mezilaborce in Slovakia, Czechoslovakia, in March 1991. So the World Congress of Rusyns, jeez, I have to use tiny little chalk here. (1991). This first Congress in Mezilaborce attracted over 200 delegates, led by the chairman of all of those new Carpatho-Rusyn organizations from Poland, Czechoslovakia or Slovakia, Ukraine, Yugoslavia, as well as the head of the Carpatho-Rusyn Research Center in the United States, representing Carpatho-Rusyns in the United States. Overall, this first Congress, characterized by an atmosphere of excitement, even euphoria. After all, this was the first time in history that Carpatho-Rusyns from 5 countries on 2 continents met to hear about the present situation and to consider joint projects to improve the future status of Carpatho-Rusyn culture and language. The very existence of the World Congress convinced the participants and eventually the governments of those countries in which they lived that Carpatho-Rusyns did exist and that they were a force with which the region's post-communist states would have to contend. Subsequent congresses were to be held every 2 years in a different country, and that process continues to the present. And at those subsequent gatherings, Carpatho-Rusyn communities from several other states, Czech Republic, Hungary, Canada, together with the United States, Romania, Serbia, and Croatia, now out of the former Yugoslavia, now they were added as permanent members. So now it was 9 permanent members. This first World Congress and most of the new organizations in the various countries where Carpatho-Rusyns lived stressed that their main concerns were cultural in nature, that is, recognition of Carpatho-Rusyns as a distinct nationality, according to the laws of each country where they live. Codification of a Rusin literary language, use of that language in schools, publications, and the media. So it's similar to what I just said earlier. One exception, slight exception, was Ukraine, the Transcarpathian region, where nearly 3/4 of all Carpatho-Rusyns in Europe lived. There, among some, expectations went beyond the merely cultural. Well, why was that the case? Well, first of all, Transcarpathia's Carpatho-Rusyns did not consider themselves a national minority, but rather they considered themselves the indigenous or autochthonous majority population. Technically, they made up the majority of the population. And then also they argued that the autonomous status of the region, remember, first as Subcarpathian Rus within interwar Czechoslovakia, then as Transcarpathian Ukraine during those last months of World War II, their argument was that that legal autonomous status was abolished by the Soviet Union in violation of international law. And therefore, Transcarpathia's indigenous Rusyns felt they had a legal precedence to demand that a autonomous region, and hence some started talking about a republic of Subcarpathian Rus, should be restored within Ukraine, regardless of what political form that country would adopt, because it was still Soviet Ukraine, wasn't clear what's going to happen to Soviet Ukraine yet. Actually, the local authorities of the region, the oblast, the Transcarpathian Oblast, still Soviet Ukraine, even encouraged these expectations on the part of Carpatho-Rusyns. In the fall of 1990, this elected regional council that represents the oblast in Uzhhorod appointed a commission of experts to study the autonomy question that we hear about all the time. And this commission came back with a recommendation calling for autonomy to be implemented in this region. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union as a whole, events were moving rapidly. Conservative elements in the Soviet Communist Party, increasingly discontent with the demands for sovereignty and even independence being announced by some of the Union republics. This displeasure, I mean, there were always people displeased with Gorbachev. And now this reached a height in August 1991. A small group of malcontented leaders in Moscow tried to remove Gorbachev and thereby to avoid further disintegration of the Soviet state. So they tried to carry out a putsch. It was advertised on television. They appeared on television. Gorbachev was vacationing in Crimea, so they tried to do that. It didn't work. It didn't work. This attempted coup failed, but it had an immediate result, and that immediate result was that some republics, including Ukraine, now proclaimed on August 21st, 1991, that it was henceforth an independent, non-Soviet state. So Ukraine declares its independence. Not sovereignty, certainly not autonomy, independence. August 21st, 1991. And in order to legitimize this move, Ukraine's parliament in Kiev proposed that a national referendum on independence that should be held in conjunction with presidential elections on December 1st, 1991. Independence in August, now let's hold a national referendum. And since it's probably going to work, we might as well choose a president at the same time. And so those next few months, September, October, November 1991, the head of the parliament, by the way, shows up here in Toronto, right opposite the football stadium in the International Hotel, and he's greeted as if he's the head of an independent country, which I guess they made a declaration, but the referendum hadn't taken place yet. And so those months, September, October, November 1991, increasing political activity, also in Ukraine's Transcarpathia, where the regional authorities, as well as this society of Carpatho-Rusyns, together with other national groups, and particularly the Hungarians, campaigned on behalf of autonomy. There were even some proposals among some segments of the public that Transcarpathia might be better off within the borders of another country. Why not go back to Czechoslovakia or Hungary? In an attempt to obtain some consensus on this matter, an agreement was reached with the central authorities in Kiev, the Ukrainian authorities, to add another question on the December 1st referendum. By the way, not everyone knows necessarily what a referendum is. I mean, coming from the United States, if any of you do, there are referendums in California all the time. Namely, it's a special question in which people are asked to vote on some kind of decision, you know, to build a dam or to pass a tax on whatever. The public is asked to vote on it. It's called, that's what is known as a referendum. And so now, we know that there's going to be a vote on Ukrainian independence. We know that there's going to be a vote for a Ukrainian president. And specifically for Transcarpathia, like California, we add a question about autonomy. The results of this referendum revealed that a substantial majority, 78% of the inhabitants, voted in favor of self-government or autonomy. And at the same time, 92% of the region's voters approved the status of Ukraine as an independent state. 63% also voted for the presidential candidate that eventually won, Leonid Kravchuk. So this is what's going on in Ukraine. For the next few weeks, the rest of December, Gorbachev is making a desperate attempt through political negotiations to preserve, at least in some form, the Soviet Union. His efforts failed, and on December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. 5 days later, never forget, televised on December 31st, 1991, the Soviet flag is taken down from the Kremlin. And that was the end of the Soviet Union. Transcarpathia's Carpatho-Rusyn activists initially welcomed all these developments. Why? Because they expected that their demands to reinstate autonomy were about to be realized within the framework of an independent Ukraine. We'll see to what degree those expectations were justified. Thank you.